So we're going to look today at a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, which is a memoir by Bronnie Ware, an Australian end-of-life care nurse. In the book, she speaks about her experiences with the dying people and about what she learned from them. And we're going to talk about 3 of these 5 regrets that she mentions in the book. We're going to do that from a philosophical perspective. Now, first of all, we have to take in account that technically we're all dying because our time on this earth is limited and none of us really knows when we're going to leave, or the great majority of us don't know when we're going to leave. Those we call the dying are usually those people who do know that their time is ending, because we can be 100 years old and still assume that we still have time and tell ourselves, one day I'll change. One day I'll fix that relationship. One day I'll call that person and say, I'm sorry. Doesn't matter how old we are. It's a human thing. We always think that we have more time. But those people we call the dying that are mentioned in this book are those people who precisely know that their time is coming to an end. And in some way, this awareness of coming death could bring clarity, could bring insight. And that is exactly what Bronnie is describing in her book. Because when we are approaching those final moments, maybe we can look a little bit more objectively at the life we have led. And that brings some weight to the words of the dying. Another thing we can sort of take into account as an introduction is that we have to acknowledge that in our culture, in modern culture, death is something that we try to obviously avoid, but we're trying also to avoid talking about it, looking at it, discussing it. It's not something that is central to our culture. It is pushed to the edges of our cultures, and it's also very much feared. And we project that fear in different ways, whether it's horror movies or, Halloween imagery, the zombies and the ghosts and the monsters we see in the front yards of houses in Halloween. It's something we try to make light of. It's a reality we don't want to face, so we try to project it to make light of. But in more traditional societies, we can say, or in some of them at least, and in a lot of cultures in the ancient world, we see a different approach to death. We see an approach that sort of says that life and death are just two aspects of the one life, a greater encompassing one life that includes both life and death as two natural sides of the same coin. Today, we cling to one side of that coin, life, and we fear the other side of that coin, death. But in some way, by avoiding the discussion and the reflection, I'm not talking about this kind of pessimistic, macabric reflection, but a deep, objective reflection about death. By avoiding that, we also fail to live fully. Because if we ignore death, if we ignore this very important part of life, it's very hard to live fully. That's why, for example, the Tibetan sages used to say that to live well is also to learn how to die well. And for that, we have philosophy, which is the art of living. But it's also what Cicero called a preparation for death. So when we know how to live well, we know also how to die well. That's also one of the conclusions that Bronnie Ware comes to in her book. But let us go to the first regret, which is probably one of the most common regrets we read about or hear about when we speak about regrets of the dying, and that is the regret of working too hard, or we can also call it a lack of work-life balance. This is sort of a very modern regret because we can't imagine, a medieval farmer or monk talking or speaking or thinking about work-life balance, right? For them, it would be very strange. They wouldn't understand that concept of work-life balance because in the past, work was integrated in a way into family, into community. There wasn't such a strict separation between work and life as we see, for example, in the show Severance, right, which is a satire in a way of our current reality. We don't have that strict separation in the past, but today we do. And for a lot of people, it seems like there could be this regret of, I worked too hard, I didn't have enough work-life balance. And it's not so much about the quantity, it's not so much about how many hours a person works. It's really about what a person sacrifices for their work. So a lot of time we hear people who regret sacrificing their family or their relationships or their dreams or even meaning for things like money and status and recognition. And in the book, Bronnie Ware talks about, she tells a story of John, who she starts taking care of when he's about 90 years old. And he tells her that he devoted his life to work and he worked very hard. And at some point, when he reached the age of retirement, his wife started nudging him that maybe he should retire because she wants to spend more time with him. She wants to travel. She wants him to be more at home. And every year kept telling her next year, next year, next year. And ironically, when he finally retired, during that year, the first year of retirement, his wife was diagnosed with terminal illness and she died within the year. And this guy, Johnny, told Bronnie that he realized that he shouldn't have postponed his retirement. And that call for, how people looked at him at work and the prestige he got from being at work, all that distracted him from what was really important, which was spending time with the people who matter, with his loved ones. And this is a good teaching. It's a good teaching about sacrifice. Usually the word sacrifice, like the word death that we mentioned before, we don't like that word. And sacrifice today has a very powerful negative association because we don't want to sacrifice anything. We want to eat the cake and have it too, as they say. But the reality is that sacrifice is not necessarily a negative thing. In fact, life would be impossible without sacrifice. If you think about it, life begins with sacrifice, right? So a mother who gives space in her body to hold another person is making quite a sacrifice. And giving birth is also not necessarily a pleasant experience. And parents who sacrifice their time and give a lot of effort and attention, which they should, to their children, are also, we can say, are making a sacrifice. And without that sacrifice, the continuity of life, hope, for a better future would not exist. So sacrifice is necessary for life. It's not a problem. The problem really is, or the question is, what we choose to sacrifice. So anyway, we're going to sacrifice something. And when I say sacrifice, I mean it in the most basic way of giving up one thing for another thing that we consider as more important. So when we sacrifice, what do we choose to sacrifice? So I can, I can sacrifice my status for my family, or maybe I can sacrifice my family for my status. I can sacrifice my values for comfort, or maybe my comfort for my values, or I can sacrifice meaning for pleasing others, or for comfort or ego, or I can sacrifice these things for meaning. The regret, I think, arises when you sacrifice something that later on you realize you shouldn't have sacrificed. We can say in some way that the best thing is to sacrifice what is lower for what is higher. Means our lower inclinations for our higher inclinations, for our best self. When we don't do that, when we sacrifice something that is more meaningful at the end of the day for something less meaningful, that's when I think the regret arises. Because again, it's not a matter of whether we sacrifice, it's a matter of what we choose to sacrifice. Do we sacrifice that thing which is a long-term thing, a constant thing, a profound, deep thing that is part of who we are, for something that is momentary, for something that is just external? Usually, when we do that, the regret will come sooner or later. In other words, don't sacrifice your best self for the demands of the ego. Try to recognize what is truly, truly more important, and not just a momentary inclination. The second regret that Bronnie Ware speaks about, we can call it living the life others expected of me. And it's not very, very different or separate from the first regret in some way, because also our choices about work are very much related often to what people think about me. But in this case, the emphasis, I would say, is more about authenticity, to be authentic. And what does it really mean to live authentically? So we can say that in some way we all inherit certain social norms. We are all born into this kind of moral aquarium, and that we don't even recognize sometimes. And these social norms tell us what is the right thing to do, what is the best way to live life. And some of these social norms are actually a result of experience, collective experience, and they're not bad. We actually should listen to them. Some of them are really wise. But sometimes these social norms come to conflict with our values, with what we consider our values, our convictions, what we recognize as the best thing for us. And when these values clash, when society's norms clash with our values, then comes a choice. We need to choose between the expectations of society and our own conscience, the expectations of society and what our sort of inner deeper self is telling us. So one story that Bronnie Ware tells us is about Grace. So I don't remember how old she is in the book, but the story is that she lived all her life under a controlling, tyrannical husband, we can say. Remember, these were the 50s or 60s, and she wasn't allowed to, to study, to travel. Her husband just wanted her to stay at home. And she endured it. She endured it. She suffered. She wanted to keep appearances. She didn't want to create conflict. And when he died, uh, she was eventually diagnosed with lung cancer. And ironically, sadly, that lung cancer was actually caused by his smoking. So we can say in some way that, her husband is at fault for controlling her, for coercing her. And of course, yes, it does bear responsibility. But also, we have to acknowledge that each of us is to some degree free to choose our responses to our environment. And she regretted allowing her husband to control her. She regretted not doing the things she wanted to do. And in some way, we can say that even though it's her husband's responsibility for acting in the way he acted, she also made a choice there. She chose not to assert her needs. I'm not saying it from a judgmental perspective. I'm just saying that this is what it was. And I'm saying that because often it's not others who stop us from living according to our values. People can make our life very difficult. There's no doubt about that. But many times it's us who do not want to assert our values, assert our beliefs, our convictions, because we are afraid of the consequences. And as a result, we regret it. I think a key idea here is that we have to recognize that it's true that living your values is hard. It's going to be hard. But living inauthentically is also hard. And you know the saying, choose your hard. That's why the Bhagavad Gita, the great book of wisdom from the Hindu tradition, has an interesting saying that it's better to live your own path imperfectly than to live somebody else's path in apparent perfection. It's like those people you see that have sort of a perfect life, but then underneath, underneath the surface, you discover that they're very unhappy. Because sometimes we're trying to live other people's dreams. We chase other people's dreams. We chase the dreams that society tells us this is what you need to chase. This is what you need to fight for. And we lack the courage to fight for our own dreams, or even to go inside and figure out what our dreams are. If we don't know really what we want to achieve, if we don't really know where we want to go, how can we find a way to get there? And then we just adopt, the paths that other people give us. So we have to choose our heart, but I think a better heart is to live authentically, because at least then you're at peace with yourself. The third regret that Bronnie Ware mentions is, we can call it, I wish I had let myself be happier. I wish I had let myself be happier. And Bronnie tells us the story of Lenny. It's actually the last story in her book. And Lenny is this elderly man in a nursing home. Usually, she didn't take care of people in a nursing home because of the environment. She usually took care of them in their houses. But in this case, she took that job and she worked with Lenny. And Lenny kept repeating that he had had a great life, a good life. And she was curious and she asked him about his life. And when he told her the story of his life, it was very hard for her to understand why he kept repeating that he had a good life. His son was killed in Vietnam. His daughter, a few years later, was killed in a car accident. He had another son who was institutionalized, and after a few years, his wife died. He had only one daughter left, and she lived in, I think it was Dubai, many, many hours away from Australia, and she couldn't come and take care of him. And Bronnie asked him, "Why do you keep repeating that your life was good? I mean, your life story is anything but." And here is where he says, and this is the direct quote from the book: "I have known love, and that love has not lessened for one day. I have known love, and that love has not lessened for one day." Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. And I think it teaches us an important lesson about happiness. So, usually we assume that happiness depends on our circumstances. So, if life gives us a nice set of cards, then we will be happy. And if life gives us, not the best set of cards, then we have all rights to be miserable and to be unhappy. And we can also look at life in a different way. It means there's a different approach. We can look at life as dual by nature. That means we all go through joys and sorrows and moments of pain, moments of joy and pleasure. There are ugly moments in life, there are beautiful moments in life. There is both. Both things exist in life. And when we recognize this, our happiness can become, we can put our happiness sort of we can attach our happiness sort of to these cycles. We can say, okay, when I'll have periods of joy and success and victory and achievement, then I'll be happy. And when I'll have moments of failure, of pain, or of lack of success, then I'll be miserable. That's one way of approaching this duality. Another way is to say, actually, no, we can approach happiness and gratitude as a sort of a practice, not just as a passive reaction to what's happening to us in life. What is this kind of practice? This is a practice of making a conscious choice of being happy. In fact, Marcus Aurelius said that it doesn't take a lot to be happy, right? So we can make a conscious choice to be grateful, to be happy. Now, I'm not talking here about this kind of repression or a kind of ignorance of sort of ignorance is bliss kind of thing, of not being aware of the pain that exists in my life or in the world. It's not about pretending that everything is fine. It's really about being a realist. That means to see not just the full half of the glass, nor just the empty half of the glass, to see the full glass, both the empty and the full, but to choose consciously to focus on the full half of the glass, even if we see also the empty half. So we're not ignorant of the suffering of ourselves, of other people, but we also see within that suffering what we can be grateful for, and those things that are still beautiful. There's a beautiful book called "The Sky Within Me." I forgot the name of the author, but she was a writer. She was a Jewish writer in Holland. Etty Hillesum. She was a Jewish writer in Holland during the World War II. and she experienced the descent into World War II, the descent into the Holocaust. She actually died in a concentration camp. But her journal is just beautiful because within all that suffering, she is able to still see the beautiful side of life. And that's very inspiring. And that even in the darkest moments, we can see something beautiful because always there is something beautiful. And there's also an interesting thing because when we choose to focus on the best, on the beautiful, in some ways, sometimes a miracle happens and those things are actually what appear. So I'm sure you have the experience of, working with someone, and like everyone else, that someone is not perfect. They have good qualities, they have bad qualities, but you choose to focus on the best qualities. And in some way, by choosing to focus on these best qualities, you bring out these qualities out of these people. Or, for example, when you choose to see the best in a situation and somehow, some magical way, this situation actually transforms itself. Because we often focus on what we miss, what we lack. We focus on criticism, we focus on failure, we focus on the bad sides of ourselves and others. But we forget that what we focus on grows. What we bring our attention to tends to grow. So if we want to grow the best, we need to focus on the best. Now, the final question we can ask in regards to this book is, what's the point? What's the point of learning when we're dying? So these people Bronnie Ware talks about are people who reach the end of their lives. They reach these beautiful moments of insight and clarity, but what's the point? They're going to die soon. What are they going to do with that, with those insights? So we can propose two answers to this question. The first thing is what we can call collective learning. This is something that is part of the human experience, something very special, because human beings use language to transmit their experience, to transmit their inner experience. And by doing so, in some way, they can prevent future generations from repeating the same mistakes. It's a very important part of human experience. And especially people who have been on this earth for quite a while, people we call elderly, they have a lot of experience to pass to future generations. So the book Bronnie Ware writes, and hopefully this lecture as well, this talk, also serve that purpose, to transmit those experiences. And this is another reason that we shouldn't neglect our elderly people, push them to the sidelines of our societies, because they have a lot of experience to give. Yes, they have made mistakes in their lives, but exactly because of those mistakes, they can teach younger generations how not to repeat those mistakes, as long as they recognize those mistakes. Because as you know, as you may know, Plato said that white hair is not always a sign of wisdom. So experience is not enough. We need also reflection, as John Dewey said. So the elderly have the experience and they have the potential to reflect on that experience and transmit the teachings that they got from these experiences to the future generations. We have to let go of all that idea of the battle of generations, the Zoomers and the Boomers and all these things. Yeah, it's clear that we're not going to think alike, but that's not necessarily bad. We all have something to teach. We all have something to learn. The second answer for that question of what's the point? Well, there's another possibility. There are studies and research There is research that suggests that consciousness doesn't end with physical death. So, for example, you have the studies done on near-death experiences by Raymond Moody. You have reincarnation studies done by Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, who interviewed hundreds and hundreds of children, remember their past lives. So there are studies. Unfortunately, this is something that again is in the sidelines of current, popular science and what people study in universities. But there's already some evidence that it's possible that consciousness may continue. And today also we have the approach of panpsychism that tells us that consciousness is actually not a result of our brain, but is actually an inherent aspect of the universe. So all these interesting directions that current science is taking us, contemporary science is taking us, is that it's a possibility that consciousness continues. And if consciousness continues, there's also the possibility that nothing we'll learn is lost. And if we look at nature, we see that nature doesn't waste anything. There is no waste in nature. Only in human life there is waste. In nature, there's no waste. Everything serves something else. Everything transforms. So these experiences and insights, according to this theory, in some way are transmitted, whether to our future selves or into this collective consciousness, if you want to call it that way. The philosopher Delia Steinberg Guzman, the second international president of Acropolis, used to teach that life is a school. It's like a school. And like in a school, when you don't learn something, when you don't really assimilate the subject matter, you're going to repeat the lessons again and again. And we can understand that because we have experienced repeating lessons again and again in our lives. And we're going to repeat them until they are learned. And maybe it would take us one lifetime, maybe more than one. But eventually, we have the possibility of learning. But I would say that maybe the wisest among us are those who don't need necessarily to go through all the experiences to learn. The wisest among us are those who recognize that we are living and working and loving next to other people. And some of them maybe are wiser a bit wiser than us. And maybe they're more experienced than us. And maybe we can learn from them as well. We don't have to go through all the experiences of pain. Because at the end of the day, the best way to let go of life is like a tree that sheds its leaves. In a very natural way, trusting, knowing, having the certainty that the sun will rise up again.